Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, April 19th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024 United States presidential election and the GOP's chances of preventing Donald Trump from becoming the Republican nominee for president. And what we're going to be going through here is discussing a number of these top Republican officials, whether they're governors or former vice presidents, just going through the candidate list here for a potential 2024 primary and looking at what they're doing in preparation for a scenario in which Donald Trump does not run for the presidency or potentially does run for the presidency. We're going to be going from Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Ron DeSantis, and looking at the overall election data just to get a general idea of why these candidates are starting to roll out early campaign efforts 3 years in advance, and why Donald Trump will be one of the hardest Republican candidates to knock out of the ring in the primary simply because of how well he is received amongst the Republican electorate and how liked he is amongst the GOP base. So, as we start off, we will see here that Mike Pompeo, and this is from the Chicago Tribune, and I think the LA Times reported on it as well. A number of news sources are starting to pick this back up because they're doing a little bit of an investigative sort of reporting on what's actually happening with these Republicans, and it's very clear that they are looking to run for president based off of some of the moves made by former presidential hopefuls back in 2016, going all the way back to 2013 with Chris Christie and Rand Paul and Jeb Bush, making names for themselves nationally speaking 3 years in advance in hopes that that would help them in the eventual primary. But of course, Donald Trump completely changed up the 2016 primary, changed up American politics forever, and that's exactly what could happen in 2024. All of these candidates could be spending all this time now to prepare for a presidential bid, and then Donald Trump walks in at the last minute and ends up winning it by pretty large margins. But Mike Pompeo, President Trump's former Secretary of State, one of the longer-lasting ones, has, quote, launched an aggressive schedule visiting states that will play a pivotal role in the 2024 Republican primaries, and he has signed a contract with the Fox News channel. So essentially, Mike Pompeo is going to try to put his name out there specifically amongst the conservative electorate. It's no surprise that he's specifically targeting Fox News rather than turning to MSNBC or CNN as a political commentator, and I'm not too confident that either of those two networks would want to have him on there. But that's besides the point. I think Mike Pompeo certainly could be trying to visit these states in hopes that they will just recognize him. To be fair, Mike Pompeo is probably the least recognizable out of the three here, and I think that he's going to do everything he can in order to make his name more recognizable. For Mike Pence, it says here that he's starting a political advocacy group, finalized a book deal, and he will be giving his first speech. So that's going to be interesting. Mike Pence is going to speak to the public. He's going to speak from South Carolina. Probably will try to discuss a new envisioned Republican Party. But Mike Pence certainly is not done with politics. I don't think 2020 was the last time that we will see Mike Pence on a ballot. Whether that's in a local race, whether that's on a presidential race, I don't know yet. But I think Mike Pence certainly has a political future amongst the Republican Party. And while he may not be liked amongst the Trump base, I think that his name and his network could be enough to put him in a powerful position, whether in the primaries or in a Senate, House, or governor election. So looking at Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, those are two Republican officials from the Trump White House. They serve directly in Washington, D.C., and that's pretty much it. For Ron DeSantis, he's from Florida. That's Donald Trump's home state. And it says here that he's been courting donors, including in Trump's backyard. Now, the reason why you might not see Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump at odds, because this certainly comes across as if Ron DeSantis is trying to peel away from President Trump's support. You see that this Michael Steele, a Republican strategist, he was part of Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign, says that they're going to need to do things they need. They're going to do the things they need to do if he decides not to run. So I think Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, and Mike Pompeo are starting to ramp up their campaign efforts, assuming President Trump is not going to run, but that hasn't been certain. Now, President Trump has been leading in the election data. A Trump advisor actually notes this and says pretty much that, you know, these candidates are going to end up losing to Donald Trump if he decides to run, saying if President Trump does decide to run in 2024, the nomination will be his if you're paying attention to the public polling of Republican voters. President Trump's campaign is not oblivious. This data is publicized, and I'm sure it goes directly to the former president's office. Looking at the nationwide polling, Donald Trump has not dipped below 40%, or actually was at 39%, but, you know, around high 30s, mid 40s. Right now, he's at 60%. It seems as if he rebounded following the Capitol insurrection. It dipped significantly as the Capitol was stormed, and that was something that was a very negative reflection on this country. And then not even 2 months later, he's right back to where he was leading into that event. And the reason why I point this out, I think that this is very interesting that the low point for President Trump was high 30s. If you look at the 2016 Republican primary data, what you'll notice is that President Trump didn't even crack high 30s until after every single candidate dropped out except for Ted Cruz and John Kasich. That means Marco Rubio was out, Ben Carson was out, Jeb Bush, Chris Christie, Carly Fiorina, Scott Walker, Rand Paul, Mike Huckabee, Bobby Jindal, Rick Perry, Rick Santorum. Just looking at the list, we have Lindsey Graham, George Pataki, whoever it is, they all dropped out. And Donald Trump only then was able to reach 40%. Which means that the entire field had pretty much been cleared by that point, because this is March 2016. A month later, he was declared the presumptive nominee. But just looking at the field that had dropped out, it took up to then for him to reach 40s. And he's doing it already at a low point. His lowest point ever was one of the highest points of his 2016 Republican primary journey. And another thing I like to point out is that President Trump won the nomination with only 46.5% of the Republican primary vote. The majority of the party did not want him at this point. He was able to win by pluralities in numerous primary elections, and given the fact that a number of these states are winner-take-most systems, or sometimes winner-take-all, and there are thresholds that would prevent Kasich or Cruz from getting delegates in certain states. Overall, President Trump was not denied the nomination, not because the majority wanted him, but rather because of the Republican Party's skewed rules in the primary system that favors the candidates who win by pluralities. And I find that to be very interesting, because when you're looking at the primary election results and you're looking at the amount of delegates that Donald Trump won, it may seem as if he was winning by super large margins, but many times he was only winning by a handful of percentage points. Looking at the 2024 primary data, we actually have some numbers out of some of these states. We have numbers out of Iowa, numbers out of Georgia, and numbers out of Florida. Now, some of these states actually benefit those, and Maine, Missouri, and New Hampshire, and North Carolina. But I want to point out one in particular that doesn't have any statewide polling. We'll go back to the statewide polling and compare it to President Trump's numbers in the past. But let's talk about South Carolina. This was a state that was, I believe, third or fourth in the Republican primary process. And President Trump only won 32.5% of the vote, yet won 100% of the delegates. Marco Rubio was only 10 points behind Trump, so was Ted Cruz. And yes, I can understand why the rest would be below 10 points. But if you're talking about a tie here for second place between Rubio and Ted Cruz, where they're both getting roughly 1/5 of the entire vote, and they get 0% of the delegates, you have to recognize that something is wrong about this system. The fact that the Democratic primary goes through a mainly proportional process, and then you have the Republican primary, which can be completely lopsided in one candidate's favor due to thresholds and winner-take-all states, you start to question whether or not the primary process on the Republican side is truly fair. If Donald Trump is able to win less than 1/3 of the vote, yet 100% of the delegates, what's to stop that from happening in 2024? Especially if he's tripled the support from that point. If you're looking at February 19th on the election data, well, if you look here, President Trump was only at 33% of the national vote. That was directly related and directly the same number of what he got in the South Carolina primary. So if it was 33% then and it's 60% now, he'll probably win more than 33% of the vote in South Carolina. And it's not just there. President Trump seems to be polling pretty high in Georgia and Iowa, which he lost to Ted Cruz back in 2016. If you're looking at a number of these states, President Trump is decimating all of the other candidates. When faced up against Nikki Haley, Mitt Romney, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Chris Christie, the same bunch from 2016, Donald Trump gets 73% of the vote in Georgia. For reference, back in 2016, he only won 38.8% of the vote and won more than double the amount of votes or delegates as Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, despite the state being, the margin only 14 points larger. It was not double the margin of Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio, which is why I find it to be very interesting that he won more than double the amount of delegates. Again, lopsided system here on the Republican Party side. Just looking at the data, President Trump is going to do well. But these candidates seem to be focusing on every single thing that they can, because the few percentages that Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence might be able to ramp up currently, and if they count on President Trump not running for office, they can sort of peel away from some of these Trump voters. Now, I don't think Mike Pence is going to be the favorite amongst Trump voters. I don't think that's something that we are going to see happen. He's not going to be the immediate frontrunner, though he might have been had he not fallen out of graces with President Trump. But the thing is here, it doesn't really matter who the frontrunner is as long as you have this built-up base and a large amount of fundraising. The thing about Mike Pence, without his vice president status, if he was disliked amongst the Trump Republican base, he probably wouldn't stand a chance. But because he's establishment, because he has connections in Washington, D.C. and around the country, he's a well-known name. He's someone that would be, one of the most well-known names out of the potential Republican candidates here. In fact, besides Donald Trump, probably the most recognizable name out of all of them. But he has not a lot of support. He'll have the money, I can guarantee you. He might have the endorsements, but I don't think he'll be able to garner support the same way Ron DeSantis could, or Ron DeSantis even is currently. And the thing about Mike Pompeo, honestly, I don't know why he's deciding to run. I think that he thinks Secretary of State might be a stepping stone to a nomination the same way it was for Hillary Clinton. But Mike Pompeo is not as energetic as Clinton or Trump or even Biden. I really think that Mike Pompeo would be just another Trump yes man and someone who could do well amongst the base if he receives the Trump endorsement, but would not fare well at all in a presidential election. You see, President Trump lost despite having a lot of energy on his side. I think there were a number of extraneous factors that brought Donald Trump to defeat, but you can't deny his very solid base, the base that was sticking with him through thick and thin. Some of these states only moved by 1 or 2 percentage points, and some of them only moved by less than that. Iowa, Ohio moved by roughly 1 point or less, despite being traditional swing states, and the last time Biden was on the ballot, those 2 states went blue. But then in 2020, went to Trump by 8 points. Donald Trump's influence was very strong in the election, and he still lost. Mike Pompeo provides no hope for the GOP in a general election and would only offer sort of this primary victory that might not even be there, because he's not even being mentioned in a lot of this pre-election data, because many people don't view him as a realistic candidate. But it seems as if he is going through the most effort, the most amount of campaign stops, or not campaign stops until he officially announces, but stops in certain states that are pivotal to the Republican primary. And it's very interesting, because you can read the tea leaves for presidential elections. You can start to see why these candidates visit Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. It's very obvious when they do a book tour that coincides directly with the primary dates and the primary states in the beginning. It's very obvious, and you can see it happening right now. Ron DeSantis, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, they're going to start to build connections across those few states and going to start to actually get donors the same way Ron DeSantis is, or get endorsements and reach out to people or make stops in Iowa or New Hampshire. And that's exactly what's happening. They're all trying to prepare for the eventual scenario in which Donald Trump does not run for president of the United States. But the thing is, when faced up against President Trump, none of them stand a chance. It doesn't matter how many years they've had to prepare. If they had 10 years, I still think Donald Trump could waltz in a week before the primary and win that primary. President Trump still has the energy. As much as the Republican Party needs to move away from this Donald Trump style of campaigning, I think that it might benefit them in certain regions, but certainly has had an adverse effect in the suburbs, which currently makes up a number of swing states in terms of the swing electorate. While President Trump was an individually strong candidate, if no one can reflect the amount of no one can replicate the amount of turnout he brought out amongst rural voters and amongst GOP voters that typically don't vote, there isn't going to be much hope for the GOP. President Trump needs to be pushed away, but also they need to recognize some aspects of him that were beneficial. But all around, I think that Donald Trump isn't exactly this candidate that would win in 2024. I think he would be a better performing Republican simply because of where he's had very solid bases. For example, Iowa, Ohio, Florida, potentially holding on to states such as North Carolina and Texas in these scenarios. But I don't think he's someone who's a winnable candidate. Amongst this Republican list, I don't see too many winnable names. Many of them are going to try the Trump style, but it's not going to work. The only one who can actually execute it is President Trump, and that's why the Republican Party is at such a crossroads here, where they go with Trump and he can bring out that turnout, but will probably lose, or they can go with a traditional GOP candidate or a Trump imitator, not bring out that turnout, potentially win in the suburbs, but it's a risk either way. The GOP doesn't have this surefire candidate that they can rely on in 2024 that can actually win. And they did in the past that they thought at least would have a much better chance. Because either they go down the pathway of President Trump and they push the suburbs away even more, or they try to win the suburbs but try to replicate Donald Trump's turnout amongst rural voters and minority voters, but can't do it. It's just a very unfortunate position for the GOP that they're stuck between two poor choices here, and it looks as if the Republican primary is already made up. But amongst these potential names, they're doing everything they can, and it's very clear. But also, I'm not hopeful about any of these candidates' chances of winning a general election. I think Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo are too closely tied to President Trump to actually be this outsider-type candidate, someone who can completely reform the image of the GOP, but chances are they probably don't want to do that. As much as it might work in the GOP's favor for future elections, immediately speaking, they know the Trump base is there. They know if they try to adopt the style of President Trump, they can win over a significant portion of the Republican primary, as we currently see. And that's going to be their decision. That's going to be ultimately what puts them ahead, and whether or not that actually works is yet to be seen. Whether or not that works in 2022, whether or not President Trump's candidates and endorsements will actually hold any type of weight beyond this year, we don't know yet. We have to see. And that will sort of shape the 2024 Republican primary, but we're already starting to see these candidates roll out their campaign efforts, roll out their campaign stops, making book deals, getting their name out, because they know as soon as they start to hear from Donald Trump that he's not going to run, they are going to go full force and run against Joe Biden or Kamala Harris in 2024. They are waiting to hear it from, the man down in Florida. They're waiting to hear from President Trump. But chances are at this point that President Trump might actually run for president of the United States, which would put all this work to rest and make this all a waste of time. But since the Republican Party doesn't know yet, we can't make an official conclusion about how it's going to go. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.